In the summer of 2019, the most powerful man on Earth picked up the phone and asked a question that made the world laugh. Can we buy Greenland? 3 words, 9 syllables, one geopolitical earthquake. The late-night comedians had a field day. The internet exploded with memes. The Danish prime minister called it absurd. But while the world was laughing, 3 separate military commands went on quiet alert because the generals weren't laughing. The intelligence analysts weren't laughing. They knew something the rest of us didn't. They knew that beneath the ice of that frozen island lies the single most dangerous choke point on planet Earth. And they knew that the country that controls Greenland controls the future itself. This is not a story about a real estate deal. This is a story about the invisible war happening right now in the Arctic. A war without bullets. A war for resources that don't exist anywhere else. A war that will determine whether your children drive electric cars or ride horses. And it all starts with a handshake that never happened, a check that was never cashed, and a secret that has been buried under the ice for 75 years. Picture this. January 1946. The Second World War has been over for exactly 4 months. The victory parades are finished. The confetti has been swept from the streets of New York. American boys are coming home on troop ships, kissing their girls on the docks, trying to forget the nightmares of Normandy and Iwo Jima. But in the Oval Office of the White House, President Harry Truman is not celebrating. He is staring at a map. Not just any map, a polar projection map. Most of us grow up looking at the Mercator projection, where Greenland looks vaguely important but distant, floating somewhere off to the side of the Atlantic. But a polar projection map shows you the world from the top down, from the North Pole looking south. And when you look at the world that way, everything changes. Suddenly, you see that the shortest distance between Moscow and New York is not across the Atlantic Ocean. It's over the Arctic, over Greenland. Truman traced his finger along that route and felt his blood run cold. He had just authorized the use of atomic bombs on Japan. He knew the terrible power of nuclear weapons, and he knew that the Soviet Union was racing to build their own. When they succeeded, and Truman knew they would, Soviet bombers would not fly the long way around. They would fly the highway of the apocalypse, straight over the North Pole, straight over Greenland, straight toward American cities. That massive white island sitting at the top of the map was not just a chunk of ice. It was the shield of North America. It was the early warning system. It was the front line of a war that hadn't started yet but was already inevitable. Truman called in his Secretary of State, a cunning political operator named James Bynes. The conversation that followed would remain classified for decades. How much? Truman asked. How much to buy it outright? Bynes, a man who thought everything at a price, didn't even blink. Denmark is broke. Europe is in ruins. We can get it. The number they settled on was staggering. $100 million. Old, not paper money, not promises. Solid gold bars from the vaults of Fort Knox. In 1946, that was an unimaginable fortune, equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. But Truman wasn't thinking about the cost. He was thinking about the alternative, the cost of losing World War III before it even began. But there was a problem, and his name was Henrik Kaufmann. Henrik Kaufmann is one of the most fascinating forgotten heroes of the 20th century. In 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded Denmark, the Danish government surrendered in 6 hours. 6 hours. The German tanks rolled across the border and the politicians in Copenhagen raised the white flag before lunch. But Henrik Kaufmann, the Danish ambassador in Washington, refused to surrender. He declared that the government in Copenhagen was acting under German duress, and therefore he, sitting safely in America, was the true representative of free Denmark. It was an audacious move. It was borderline insane. The Danish government charged him with treason. They fired him. They demanded he return home to face trial. Kaufmann ignored them. Instead, he did something extraordinary. On April 9, 1941, exactly 1 year after the Nazi invasion, Kaufmann walked into the office of President Franklin Roosevelt and signed a treaty. The treaty gave the United States permission to build military bases on Greenland to protect it from German occupation. He signed it on his own authority, claiming to represent the King of Denmark. The government in Copenhagen was apoplectic with rage, but there was nothing they could do. The Americans were already landing in Greenland. For 4 years, Henrik Kaufmann essentially ruled Greenland from his office in Washington, D.C. He became known as the King of Greenland. The Americans built air bases, weather stations, and radar installations. They fought a secret war against German weather teams on the ice, a conflict so obscure that most history books don't even mention it. By the time World War II ended, the United States had been occupying Greenland for 5 years. The American military had grown comfortable there. They had invested millions. They had infrastructure. They had familiarity. They felt in a deep psychological way that Greenland was already theirs. So when Truman decided to make it official, he assumed it would be a formality. He assumed Denmark would be grateful to hand over the burden. He was wrong. December 1946. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, a symbol of American wealth, American power, American confidence. In a private suite, James Byans sat across from the Danish foreign minister, Gustav Rasmussen. The contrast could not have been starker. Byans was the picture of American swagger, well-fed, expensively dressed, representing a nation that had emerged from the war stronger than ever. Rasmussen looked exhausted. Denmark had been looted by the Nazis. The economy was in ruins. People were burning peat for heat because there was no coal. Children were malnourished. The infrastructure was crumbling. Byans laid out the American position with the cold logic of a banker making a hostile takeover bid. Greenland is a financial drain. It costs you millions to administer. It produces nothing but fish and a little cryolite. You cannot defend it. You cannot develop it. Why burden yourself with this frozen wasteland? Then he slid a piece of paper across the table. $100 million in gold. Rasmussen stared at the number. He knew his country was broke. He knew that money could rebuild Copenhagen. It could build hospitals and schools. It could save a generation from poverty. For a long moment, he said nothing. The temptation must have been overwhelming. But then Rasmussen looked up and saw something in Byans' eyes. Arrogance. The arrogance of an empire that thought everything had a price. And Rasmussen understood something that Byans did not. Nations are not businesses. They are made of history and blood and identity. Denmark had already been humiliated once. They had surrendered to Germany in 6 hours. That shame haunted the Danish psyche like a ghost. If they sold Greenland now, if they put their own territory up for sale like a used car, they would never recover their dignity. But there was another factor, a factor that terrified Rasmussen even more than shame. Fear. Fear of the Soviet Union. Denmark was a small, flat country sitting right on the doorstep of the Russian Bear. The Red Army was occupying East Germany just a few hundred miles away. Soviet submarines prowled the Baltic Sea. If Denmark sold Greenland to the United States, Stalin would interpret it as an act of war. He would see it as Denmark officially joining the American camp, and he might decide to punish them for it. Rasmussen was walking a tightrope over a pit of wolves. He had to say no to the Americans without angering them, and he had to keep Greenland without provoking the Soviets. So he chose his words carefully. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "that honor prevents Denmark from selling any part of the kingdom." Byans leaned back, his jaw tight. He knew a rejection when he heard one. The meeting ended politely, but the message was clear. Greenland was not for sale. Truman was disappointed, but he was a pragmatist. If he couldn't buy the island, he would do the next best thing. He would occupy it without owning it. In 1951, Truman forced Denmark to sign the Defense of Greenland Agreement. It was a masterpiece of unequal negotiation. The treaty gave the United States the right to build and maintain military bases on Greenland, the right to fly over the territory, the right to station troops, the right to legal jurisdiction over American personnel. It was essentially a lease with no end date and no rent. Denmark kept the flag. America kept the power. And then the military moved in for real. In the far northwest of Greenland, at a place called Thule, the United States began one of the largest construction projects in human history. They called it Thule Air Base. Today it's known as Pitafik Space Base. Thousands of American servicemen were shipped to the Arctic. They worked through the 24-hour darkness of winter, through blizzards that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, through temperatures that made steel brittle and diesel fuel turn to jelly. They built a runway 10,000 feet long, capable of handling the massive B-36 Peacemaker bombers. These bombers were the size of office buildings, with 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines. They were designed to carry nuclear weapons deep into Soviet airspace. From Thule, a bomber could reach Moscow and return without refueling. It was the dagger pointed at the heart of the Soviet Union. But there was a cost, a human cost that Denmark and America tried to hide for decades. In May 1953, American commanders decided they needed to expand the air defense perimeter around Thule. There was a problem. People lived there. The Inuit, a small tribe of Inuit hunters, had lived on that land for centuries. They had homes, hunting grounds, and ancestral graves. The American military told the Danish government the locals had to go, and Denmark, terrified of upsetting their powerful protector, gave the order. The Inuit were given 4 days. 4 days to pack their lives onto dog sleds. 4 days to leave the only home they had ever known. In the middle of the Arctic spring, they walked north across the ice. Mothers carried bobbies. Old people struggled through the snow. They walked nearly 100 miles to a new settlement called Qaanaaq. When they arrived, there was nothing. No houses, no infrastructure. They lived in tents on the ice while they tried to build new homes. It was an act of ethnic cleansing in the name of national security. For decades, the Danish government denied it was a forced eviction. They claimed the Inuit had moved voluntarily. It was a lie born of desperation and shame. The people of Thule would not receive an apology or compensation for more than 40 years. But the Americans weren't done. If anything, they were just getting started. In 1959, the U.S. Army launched one of the most bizarre and terrifying projects of the Cold War. Publicly, they told the Danish government they were building a scientific research station called Camp Century. They said they were testing construction techniques in extreme cold. They built it about 150 miles inland from Thule, directly on top of the Greenland ice sheet. And what they built was astonishing. They dug massive trenches in the ice, covered them with steel arches, and buried them under snow. Inside these tunnels, they constructed an entire city. Barracks, a dining hall, a library, a chapel, a movie theater, even a barbershop. They installed a portable nuclear reactor to power it all. Camp Century was a marvel of engineering. Scientists came to study the ice. Journalists were given tour. It looked like a benign research facility, but it was all a lie. The real purpose of Camp Century was to test the feasibility of Project Iceworm. Project Iceworm was a plan to build a vast network of tunnels under the Greenland ice sheet. Inside these tunnels, the U.S. military planned to deploy 600 nuclear missiles mounted on mobile launchers. The missiles would be constantly moving through the tunnels on railway cars, so the Soviets could never target them. It was the ultimate stealth weapon, a nuclear shotgun pointed at Russia from beneath eternal ice. The Danish government knew nothing about the missiles. They had a strict policy: no nuclear weapons on Danish soil. The Americans were planning to violate that policy on a staggering scale. Project Iceworm ultimately failed, but not because of politics. It failed because of nature. The Greenland ice sheet is not static. It flows like an extremely slow river. The tunnels began to warp and collapse under the immense pressure of the shifting ice. The nuclear reactor had to be removed. The base was abandoned in 1967 and left to be crushed by the glacier, but the secret remained buried. Until 1968, January 21, 1968, a cold, clear day over Baffin Bay, just off the northwest coast of Greenland. A B-52 Stratofortress bomber was flying a routine patrol mission. Routine, except for one detail. The bomber was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. This was part of a program called Operation Chrome Dome. During the height of the Cold War, the United States kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air 24 hours a day, every day, flying in circles along the borders of Soviet airspace. The logic was simple. If the Soviets launched a surprise attack and destroyed America's land-based missiles, the bombers already in the air could still retaliate. It was a cornerstone of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. But that day, something went wrong. A fire broke out in the cockpit. The crew tried to fight it, but the flames spread rapidly. The pilots gave the order to bail out. 6 crew members ejected. The B-52, now a flying torch, continued on autopilot for a few more miles before crashing onto the frozen sea ice near Thule Air Base. When the plane hit the ice, the conventional explosives in the 4 hydrogen bombs detonated. They did not cause nuclear explosions, but they shattered the plutonium cores of the weapons. Radioactive material scattered across the ice in a plume of toxic dust. It was a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions. The United States and Denmark launched a massive cleanup operation, codenamed Project Crested Ice. Hundreds of workers were sent onto the frozen sea in temperatures of 20 below zero to scrape up contaminated snow and ice. They loaded it into barrels and shipped it back to the United States for disposal. But here's the thing. They only found 3 of the 4 bombs. One of the hydrogen bombs was never fully accounted for. To this day, there is speculation that parts of it remain on the ocean floor beneath Baffin Bay. The accident revealed the truth. The United States had been flying nuclear weapons over Greenland for years in direct violation of Denmark's ban on nuclear weapons. The Danish public was outraged. The government was humiliated. It was revealed that the Prime Minister had given secret approval for the flights despite the public policy. The scandal rocked Danish democracy, but strategically nothing changed. Because the hard truth was this: Denmark needed American protection, and America needed Greenland. The alliance held. The secret was smoothed over, and the bombers kept flying. For decades, Greenland was valued purely for its location. But then something happened, something that changed everything. The ice began to melt. Climate change, the disaster that is destroying ecosystems and flooding coastlines, did something unexpected. It revealed what was hidden beneath the ice: ancient rock formation, geological anomalies, and most importantly, minerals. Not just any minerals, rare earth elements. If you've never heard of rare earth elements, you're not alone. They have boring names like neodymium, dysprosium, and europium, but they are the vitamins of the modern world. You cannot build a smartphone without them. You cannot build an electric car without them. You cannot build a wind turbine without them. And most critically, you cannot build an F-35 fighter jet, a Tomahawk cruise missile, or a nuclear submarine without them. Here's the problem. For the last 30 years, one country has controlled the production of these elements: China. Today, China processes about 90% of the world's rare earth elements. They have a chokehold on the future of technology. If Beijing decided tomorrow to stop exporting these materials, the American military would grind to a halt within months. Silicon Valley would go dark. The green energy revolution would die. This is the nightmare that keeps Pentagon strategists awake at night. But there is a way out, and it lies buried in the mountains of southern Greenland, a place called Kvanefjeld. Kvanefjeld sits on top of what geologists believe is the largest deposit of rare earth elements in the world. It's the Saudi Arabia of the future. The country that controls Kvanefjeld controls the global technology supply chain. And suddenly, Greenland isn't just a military outpost. It's the most valuable piece of real estate on planet Earth. Which brings us back to that phone call in August 2019, when President Donald Trump asked his advisors about buying Greenland. The media treated it as a joke. Another example of an unconventional president saying something outrageous. But if you were sitting in the Pentagon, you weren't laughing. You were looking at projections showing that global demand for rare earth elements is expected to increase by 500% by 2030. You were looking at reports about Chinese companies buying stakes in Greenlandic mining operations. You were looking at maps showing Russian military buildup in the Arctic. And you were thinking the exact same thing Harry Truman thought in 1946. We need to own this island. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, rejected the offer immediately. She called it absurd. The media mocked Trump for weeks, but quietly behind the scenes something changed. The United States opened a consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, for the first time in decades. They started pouring millions of dollars into aid programs. High-level delegations visited Greenland to court local politicians. The State Department suddenly cared deeply about Greenlandic independence movements, because even though the purchase offer failed, it sent a message. It told the world, Greenland is back on the table. The great game for the Arctic has begun. And this time, it's not just about missiles and bombers. It's about the minerals that will power the next 100 years. So here we are. 75 years after Harry Truman offered a fortune in gold, the struggle for Greenland continues. Denmark still owns the island on paper, but the United States has military bases, radar installations, and deep political influence. China is trying to buy mining rights and build infrastructure. Russia is militarizing its Arctic coast and watching the new shipping lanes open as the ice melts. And caught in the middle are 56,000 Greenlanders who are tired of being a chess piece. They want independence. They want to control their own destiny, but they know that independence requires money. And the only way to get money is to sell their resources or their strategic location. It's an impossible choice. Sell to China and anger America. Accept American military expansion and become a target. Stay with Denmark and remain dependent forever. The story of Greenland is the story of the 21st century. It's about climate change revealing new resources and new shipping routes. It's about great powers competing for technological supremacy. It's about indigenous people fighting for dignity in a world that sees them as obstacles. Harry Truman never got his island. His check was rejected. But in every way that matters, America owns Greenland today. They own the radar. They own the runways. They own the strategic reality. The flag flying over the ice is red and white, but the shadow cast beneath it is red, white, and blue. And as the ice continues to melt and the treasure beneath is revealed, that shadow will only grow darker. This is the island America can't buy. But it's also the island America will never let go. The war for Greenland is not coming. It's already here, and you're living in it right now.